presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to today's Society of Decision Professionals Learning Exchange. My name is Hilda Chorakjian, and I have the pleasure of introducing today's presentation, Everything We Know is Wrong. I would now like to introduce you to the speakers you will be hearing from today. Our featured speaker is Pat Leach. Pat was originally trained in decision analysis while working for Texaco. He left Texaco in late 2001 and became the managing director of APM International. Pat joined the SI in late 2004 as a senior consultant and is now the CEO of the company. During his consulting career, he has worked on dozens of projects for a variety of clients ranging from 2-hour VOI analysis to multi-year arrangements on major capital projects to corporate-level strategic initiatives. He has also trained hundreds of individuals in basic decision analysis and probabilistic methods. Pat has published a book titled Why Can't You Just Give Me the Number? An Executive's Guide to Using Probabilistic Thinking to Manage Risk and to Make Better Decisions. Pat is also a fellow of the Society of Decision Professionals. Pat, welcome to today's Learning Exchange.
Thanks, Hilda.
I would also like to introduce Eric Johnson. Eric is Associate Director of Decision Analysis at Bristol Myers Squibb, where he leads teams find more valuable ways to develop their compounds. Eric is a fellow and board member of the Society of Decision Professionals and chair the SDP's Knowledge Sharing Coordination Council. Eric, welcome to today's Learning Exchange. Eric? I think he's on mute.
Oh, thank you, Hilda.
Okay, you're welcome.
Sorry.
Eric will be moderating today's presentation and fielding your questions to Pat. And now, without any further delay, I'd like to turn today's presentation over to our featured speaker, Pat. Pat, you have the floor.
Okay, thanks, Hilda. Okay, Everything We Know is Wrong. That's a relatively provocative title, I hope. One of the things that I love about DAG is you can kind of throw ideas out there and get feedback on them. And this is obviously a little bit tongue-in-cheek or a bit of an overstatement. But seriously, what I am trying to do with this presentation is to kind of prod people into thinking about things that we tend not to think about and reconsidering some things that we tend to just sort of take for granted or assume are true, and I'm not quite so sure that they are anymore. But before we get started on the presentation, we do have our poll that we want to do. So let's move to our first poll question here, and these are all somewhat related to what I'm going to talk about here. But here's the poll. If you won the lottery and were given a choice between the following payment plans, which would you choose? Would you rather have $5 million per year for 20 years or $40 million today? And so we'll give everybody a little bit of time to make your choices there. I can still see the numbers changing somewhat, although the numbers, don't think about this too long, folks. Go ahead and make your choice, please. And I think we'll close the polls now. Okay? So you can see the results there. It's about 50-50. Okay? What is it? 46-53. Okay, so I'll comment on that a little bit more at the end of the 4 poll questions. We've got 4 of these we're going to do quickly. Okay, so let's move to the next one. With which of these statements do you most strongly agree? Statement number 1 is, I do not have access to enough information. I could do better with more. Number 2 is, I have access to just about enough information. And number 3 is, I have access to far more information than I need. I spend time filtering it out. So, again, we'll give everybody a little bit of time to make your selections there. Obviously, there aren't any right or wrong answers on something like this. We're just trying to get a feel for how people approach this type of thing. So I'll give you another couple of seconds, and then we'll close it out. So, yeah, let's go ahead and close that out, if we will. So, what is that? 28, 25, and 46 are where we are. Not too surprising. In today's internet-dominated world, people tend to have access to a lot of information. But actually, a fair number of people feel that they need even more. So that's interesting. We'll talk a bit more about that later. The next question. Okay. If you have two gerbils, one male and one female, who have just reached sexual maturity, loads and loads of gerbil food, let's say an infinite amount, and no gerbil predators, approximately how many gerbils would you have after 3 years? So this is a somewhat whimsical question, but it is related to some of the things that we're going to talk about when the talk comes up, or once I get doing the presentation. So again, I can still see people making your choices. I hope no one's actually trying to do the math, because that would take a little while. Plus, there are probably aspects, unless you're a gerbil breeder, there are aspects of figuring this out that I would doubt that many people in the audience have at their fingertips.
I think it's okay for them to do the math, but we don't want them to run off and buy the gerbils right now.
Correct.
So.
Yeah, that would be a bad idea, unless you have a good stern talking to them about safe sex. So, okay, let's give everybody a second or two, and then let's close this down. It looks pretty stable. Okay, we'll close it down. Okay, surprisingly flat. Well, maybe a little bit surprisingly flat. 24, 34, 21, and 19%. This is actually the only one of the questions which has an answer, at least if you actually use things like how long it takes a gerbil to reach sexual maturity, what the gestation period is, how often female gerbils go into heat, what the average size of a litter is, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, the answer is about 100 million. It's about 97 million gerbils that you would have after 3 years if they all had average-sized litters and everything happened fine according to nature and none of them died. So pretty staggering number. And again, the reason that I threw this in here, I'm going to touch a little bit on exponential growth in the talk. And this is just kind of a funny example of it. So, okay, let's move on to our last poll question here. Suppose you owed someone $50,000. How would you prefer to pay this debt, assuming that you actually had $50,000 in a liquid account, which you didn't need for current necessities, okay? And the choices are you can pay $50,000 today, or you can pay $6,000 per year for 15 years, and that would start next year, not this year. So we'll give everybody a little bit of time to choose your selections here. And they're still dancing around a little bit, so I'm going to give it a little more time here. Okay, let's give them another couple of seconds, and then we'll close it out. Okay. I wrote down the numbers, 42 and 57. Okay. Actually, it's a little bit interesting. I was curious as to how this would compare with the first one, obviously, where you were receiving money rather than paying a debt. On the first one, 53% said you'd take the $40 million now. Only 46% said you'd take the $5 million per year for 20 years. The discount rate that I used, actually, to get the 40 is 13%, which is pretty steep. So if you're taking all that money now, you're sort of assuming that you can do better than 13%, or you're not sure you're going to be around for another 20 years, or maybe you've got a big project that you want to embark on and you need more than $5 million to do it. The percentages on this one, paying now versus stretching the time out, is about the same ratio, 42 to 57. And the interest rate assumed, if you're going to pay $6,000 a year for 15 years, is actually 8.5%, which is, again, a little steep for today. And yet more than half of the people here would rather stretch it out over time. And you'll see, or I hope you'll see, how this can relate to at least one of the topics that I'm going to talk about here. The approach that I'm going to take on this presentation is really, I call them 3 myths that I'm going to try to persuade you that at the very least we need to rethink them, and possibly they're simply wrong. So let's go ahead and shift on to the next slide if we can. And so here's myth number 1. Increased information flow improves economic efficiency, obviously somewhat related to the poll that we took about information. I've talked in the past, in fact in DAG presentations in the past, about complex nonlinear systems, okay? And I'm going to bring them up again here in a very simplified form because it's an easy way to get across what I'm trying to get across here. So you can take, if you have a complex nonlinear system, and this certainly describes the global economy. Okay, the economy is a complex nonlinear system. It's often done with agent-based modeling. If you have a system like this, you can plot it along a matrix with two axes, one being increasing interconnectedness and the other being increasing predictability. And I'll explain in a couple of minutes what I mean by that, but it's important to realize that it's the system that's being plotted here, not individual actors or agents, okay? So what do I mean by increasing interconnectedness and increasing predictability? Let's take a look at a very simple complex model, which is obviously a contradiction in terms, but bear with me here. In this little model, every square is an agent, and the agent is simply either a 0 or a 1 in any given time step. And the way that an agent decides whether to be a 0 or a 1 is it has a set of rules that it uses when it looks at what other agents have done in time t minus 1. So let's take a look at our little agent here, this green agent, and let's assume that our green agent looks at the 4 agents to the north, south, east, and west of itself, and depending upon what pattern it sees in time t minus 1, it decides to be a 0 or a 1 in time t. Okay, that would be one sort of type of system, and all the other agents in the model would be doing the same thing. Now, suppose you had another system in which that same agent looks at all 8 of the agents around it. That would be an example of a model or a system with higher interconnectedness than the first one was. So interconnectedness is actually a pretty simple concept. It's just how many other agents does each agent look at or pay attention to or take into consideration when making its decision. So that's the interconnectedness axis along the previous graph. Let's go back to the situation where our agent is only looking at 4 other agents immediately to the north, south, east, and west. Now, with 4 agents, and each of those agents can either be a 0 or a 1 in time t minus 1, so there are 16 different possible patterns, 2 to the 4th, that our little green agent might see when it looks at what the other agents have done. And the yellow portions of these matrices here show those 16 possible patterns. The difference between the matrix on the left and the matrix on the right is what set of rules is our little agent using. On the left, our agent is using a set of rules in which for half of the patterns that it sees, 8 of the patterns, it would choose a 1, and for the other half, the other 8, it would choose a 0. That would be an example of a rule set that results in low predictability. You'd have a hard time. You would not be quite sure if you were trying to forecast whether our little agent was going to be a 1 or a 0. And the same thing would be true extrapolated out to the whole system if the entire system has rules which are either fairly balanced like this, in which, for lack of a better way of putting it, our agents kind of have a lot of freedom, versus the one on the right here, where our little agent, in 15 of the 16 scenarios that he might see, he chooses a 1. And obviously it would be just the same if in 15 of the 16 he chose a 0. We could forecast our agent's behavior with a pretty high degree of predictability. And so that type of, it's a very simple way to think of the predictability axis, but it's a fairly effective one. So if we now go back to our matrix here, and this is going to tie into everything we know is wrong any moment now. If we go back to our little matrix, I've now put bands of color on here, right? And the lower right-hand corner, where you have high predictability and low interconnectedness, I'm calling the stagnant zone. Well, I say I'm calling it that. I'm referencing Stuart Kaufman here, actually. In this area, the models, if you have a model in which the rules and the setup, the system itself, falls into this zone, then as soon as you turn the model on, it pretty quickly hits a static state and stays there. And you might have 1 or 2 flipping here and there back and forth, but not much. It's pretty much stagnant. And if you were to reach in and flip one of the agents from a 0 to a 1 or a 1 to a 0, the model really doesn't do much. In fact, you might get no reaction whatsoever. So think Soviet-era state-run economies. okay? Very high predictability. Every day is pretty much like every other. Very low interconnectedness. What happens in St. Petersburg has no effect on what happens in Moscow, at least not directly, okay? If the price of potatoes is suddenly doubled, the price of bread stays the same because the state is setting all of these prices, or the price of rice stays the same. So the model, the system, doesn't react to changes, okay? Stagnant. And this is pretty much a description of what those economies look like. If you visited Poland in late 1960s, it looked pretty much like Poland did in the early 1950s. Not much had changed. If you look in the upper left-hand corner, I've called that the chaotic zone, where you have high interconnectedness and very low predictability. If you build a little model for this, all the little agents just flicker back and forth between ones and zeros randomly, and you don't detect any patterns. It's chaos. It really is, okay? And if you were to reach in and in a nanosecond flip one of those agents from 1 to 0 before it had a chance to do it itself, you really wouldn't see any significant reaction in the model because they're all just flipping crazily from 1 to 0s anyway and back and forth. In between these two areas, if your system or if your model falls in here, you have what Kaufman calls an efficient zone or a band of efficiency. And it's sort of in this boundary between chaos and a stagnant situation or an overly stable situation. Models in this zone are interesting. They develop patterns, and you can actually see patterns as they move through the model. Sometimes, if it's a complicated enough model, it might even sweep from one dynamic stability to another form of dynamic stability as the model itself shifts from one strange attractor to another. If you reach in and you flip an agent in this type of a model, you can sometimes see sort of the waves of information move through the model as the system takes that into account and changes. This is where a well-run market economy would be. Okay, it's sort of chaotic. Nobody's really in charge, but it's not total chaos. There are rules. And so by and large, market economies tend to be efficient. Now, what I'm going to propose is that mankind sort of started off in the lower right-hand corner or awfully close to it, certainly in the stagnant zone. As I said at DAG, when you're a hunter-gatherer, every day is pretty much like every other day. So very high predictability on your behavior, on what you're going to be doing, very low interconnectedness. If you're hunting and gathering in a specific valley in the East Africa Rift Zone, you have no idea what's happening on the other side of the hill, let alone what might be happening, say, off in Europe by the Neanderthals or whomever. Over time, though, we sort of, interconnectedness increased, and I'm speculating that it increased sooner than predictability decreased. The Spice Road came into being. Trade routes started to come into place, and this is obviously quite a bit, later than the hunter-gatherer stage. But people started to find out about each other, and you did find out what was going on in Europe, even if you lived in the Nile Valley. It might be months after it happened, but there was some degree of interconnectedness. I then think over a period of time we moved fairly rapidly downward on predictability and upward on interconnectedness. And this, I'm postulating, is when democracies started to come into place, when free market economies really started to kick in. And so if you didn't like your government, you can actually vote them out, okay? And so things would change depending upon what, say, the king or the government did. The same thing was true with the economy. If you didn't like what you were doing, it may not be easy to switch and do something different, but you could. And lots of people actually completely left their homelands and went off to do something different in a new place. So we're moving closer and closer to the efficient zone, you'll notice, with each of these things, each of these movements. Continuing and perhaps more steeply on the interconnectedness axis there, television and radio come into being. Now you can find out what's going on the other side of the world the same day that it happened, okay? You just got to tune into the news that evening. And predictability is still going down. There's probably an asterisk on that, but I'll deal with that a little bit later. But by and large, markets are getting looser. My concern is look at what happens if we continue along this direction, and I would suggest we are continuing along, certainly, especially the north-south direction, quite rapidly, and that arrow probably has to angle up and to the left, because for the past 30 years, we've been deregulating things, and so there have been fewer rules on what people can do and greater freedom, lower predictability. But probably the dominant factor is the fact that we are all so interconnected now. Now, not only can you find out what happened on the other side of the world the day it happened, you can find out as it's happening. We all have cell phones in our pockets, and we all find out information instantaneously, whether that information is true or not. And so what I'm speculating is the possibility that we've overshot the mark here. Now, I don't know that this has happened, and Eric and I even had a conversation yesterday, I think it was, about how would you know when you've overshot the mark. But I would say that certainly the chaos that seems to dominate the global economy and the volatility in the markets and things of that sort would indicate that something is wrong, and it may not be a routine thing that's wrong. It may be something new. And certainly if we are on the chaotic side of the efficient zone, that's new, because we've never been there before. And what worked on the stagnant side isn't going to work on the chaotic side. So the point is, once you overshoot the mark here on interconnectedness, system efficiency actually decreases. So what do you do about this? If we go back to our little chart here, I don't see any way you can decrease interconnectedness. You can't go around taking people's cell phones away. The libertarians in the crowd aren't going to like it, but what you can do is re-regulate. Specifically, just choosing an industry at random. Let's say the finance industry. Putting back in place some regulations might actually increase efficiency, and that's counter to our experience over the past hundreds of years. But I think it may actually be the case. So that's myth number one. We're going to move on to myth number two, okay? Steady economic growth is achievable and desirable. Think gerbils, okay? So here's a gerbil question for you. Suppose everyone in ancient Egypt had 1,000 cubic centimeters of stuff, and that sounds like a lot of stuff, but it's actually a cube about 4 inches on a side. And suppose they had managed an annual growth rate of stuff of only 1%. Okay, that's not a very high growth rate. How much stuff would they have today? And this assumes, by the way, that there were about 100,000 people in ancient Egypt, which I got from Wikipedia, so you know it must be true. The answer is enough to cover the Earth in a layer of stuff almost 40,000 kilometers thick, which, of course, is ridiculous. The Earth itself is only about 13,000 kilometers across. So this is a somewhat tongue-in-cheek example, but it does show that you simply, even a very low rate of exponential growth is unsustainable in the long run. You simply cannot sustain it, okay? If you don't like the initial assumptions, even if I back off and say, okay, suppose you only had one ancient Egyptian, and he had 1 cubic centimeter of stuff and managed an annual growth rate of 1%, how much stuff would that one guy have, although he'd be dead by now? And the answer comes back, enough to cover the Earth in a layer of stuff 16 meters thick. So exponential growth in the long run is simply impossible. Now, I can imagine people protesting, wait a minute, you're talking about growth of stuff. That's very different from economic growth. I would suggest that they're not quite as different as you might think. Money really is to wealth as electricity is to energy. Electricity is not a source of energy. It's just a convenient way to move energy from one place to another. Money is not a source of wealth. Money is just a convenient way to transfer wealth from one place to another. Wealth is still basically stuff when you come right down to it. And so how we can generate more and more wealth without generating more stuff is kind of difficult to imagine. And in fact, if you stop to think about it, anything that we think of as contributing to the economy generally uses resources and creates waste. And that's stuff. So economic growth simply cannot go on forever. And in the immortal words of Herbert Stein, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. There's something to be said for having a grasp of the obvious. So why do we try to achieve economic growth year after year? Whether you're a country or a company, this is like the objective that everyone has. Every year, annual steady growth. And we know we can't sustain it. So why is this? Why do we use this as a measure of success and a measure of progress? It just doesn't make sense. We're going to have to shift at some point or another. Myth number 3, cash today is worth more than cash tomorrow. So this is the whole discounted cash flow argument. NPV assumes that money today is worth more than money tomorrow. Okay? But we just talked about, or I tried to make a case, that really money, cash, is not wealth. Really, we're talking about stuff here. And so if you transfer that statement into stuff, food, water, steel, energy, whatever, if the supply is limited, which increasingly it is, as the world is increasingly populated, would you want all of it up front? Why would you want it all up front? I've made the case before, and I'm making the case again, that there's an underlying assumption in NPV, which is there's always more stuff out there to get. And that's the only way that it could possibly make sense to always want to get stuff today rather than tomorrow. And yet, I'm proposing that we're moving into a stage where that's no longer the case. An analogy I use is, if you're on a cruise ship, you might as well eat as much as you want every day because you're never going to run out of food. If you're in a lifeboat, you might want to think about saving that second sandwich for later in the week. So consider 2, you can call these projects, strategies, policies, whatever they are, A and B. A gives lots of goodies, benefits, and rewards up front, and all the costs are deferred years into the future. B has significant costs and sacrifices up front, but yields enormous benefits to everyone years down the road. Which one would be favored by an NPV analysis? Obviously, Project A. In fact, there's a famous quote that NPV values our grandchildren at 0. Most of us don't value our grandchildren at 0, so why are we obsessed with these metrics which do so? And in fact, a couple weeks ago, I attended a conference where a woman named Tima Bansal at Western University in Ontario gave a presentation in which she took a different angle on this, but I thought it was a really good insight, which is that when something happens is important. When we get the rewards, when we pay the costs, all that stuff is important. And when we discount our cash flows back to a single number, we take time completely out of the discussion. We are no longer comparing 2 cash flows and saying, which of these do we like better? Which one do we think creates more value? Now we just collapse them down to a single number. Why do we want to do that? It's sort of lazy man's way of considering things, because inherent in that is this assumption that the all-powerful discount rate that we've chosen is somehow correct. When, in point of fact, in most companies, the discount rate is simultaneously sacred and pretty much arbitrary. And so it's kind of crazy to use that. And yet we do it all the time without even thinking twice. It is the metric.
Pat, let me interject with a question that may be pertinent here. The comment says NPV is not wrong, it's just too high. And let me also put a spin on that question is, who says it's too high? I mean, this is so what would be your take on either of those points?
I assume when they say too high that they mean the discount rate is...
Yeah, the discount rate.
Yeah, well, if you discount it at all, you are assuming that it's better to have it today than it is to have it tomorrow. And with good reason you're assuming that, because for the past 200 years or so, well, certainly in let's say the 150 or 160 years since the concept of discounted cash flows and NPV was created, that was generally true. Because if you got all your money up front, you could turn around and do more things with it tomorrow rather than waiting, right? But again, what I'm proposing is that at the time that NPV was invented, you still had entire continents out there waiting to be exploited. That's not the case anymore. When we use up resources and at what rate we generate waste is a much more serious issue, or at least is worthy of discussion today, more so than perhaps it was necessary to discuss these things 150 years ago. NPV all but precludes that discussion. And you know, why are we still using a 150-year-old metric and using it as sacrosanct? I'm suggesting that perhaps we just need to think a bit more. And the interesting thing is that if you go into a country which is keenly aware of the limits of its own resources, some of the countries in West Africa, by and large, they don't just do NPV, they don't do discounted cash flow analyses and run with them. Doesn't matter what the discount rate is. They're interested in seeing to it that their resources last a while to provide benefits for their kids and their grandchildren. Now, a lot of, say, Western society historically hasn't worried about that. We've used up the resources in our own area, and then we've moved on to a different part of the world and started using the resources there. But we're kind of hard-pressed to find parts of the world that we haven't already scoped out for resources. And I'm not trying to get into a peak oil argument or any of that nonsense, okay? It isn't a question of will it happen, it's a question of when it happens. And I guess I'm taking a little bit of umbrage with the argument, well, if it happens far enough in the future, why should we care? I think we still should care.
Well, let's follow up on that. And we've got a couple more questions on this front. Do you encourage CEOs of small consultancies to abandon NPV as a way of taking a look at the way their company is doing?
No. Again, you don't abandon something because you recognize the weakness in it. You just recognize the weakness in it. NPV is still a useful metric to use. It's just not the end-all and be-all. I don't think it should be our end-all and be-all when it comes to deciding value. And yet, very often, it is. I mean, we use it as the proxy for value. And we use other metrics too, but most of those are still based on discounted cash flows as well. What you really ought to be doing, but it's much more difficult to do, is actually looking at the cash flows through time and saying which of these do we like better. And how far down the line can we realistically see? So, you know, there's obviously a great deal of uncertainty about what the cash flow will be, say, 20 years down the road. NPV kind of neatly deals with that by discounting it down to next to nothing. So we don't worry about it anymore. Maybe we should be concerned about it. It's sort of a long-term view. Again, at that same conference a couple weeks ago, Jim Rogers, who's the CEO of Duke Energy, the phrase he used in his talk, he gave the keynote address at dinner, was we need to promote cathedral thinking, was what he called it. And he pointed out that, for instance, when the Cathedral of Notre Dame was built in Paris, it took something like 4 generations to build. The guys who laid the foundation never saw the main part of the building. The guys who built the main part of the building never saw the spires. And yet, if you look at what they built, it's fantastic. It's majestic. It was definitely a worthwhile endeavor. But they worked long and hard and got none of the benefits because they knew they were building something for the ages. And so Jim Rogers was trying to promote that kind of thinking rather than, hey, can we make next quarter's numbers? So that would be my angle on it. And again, trying to provoke here a bit too.
Well, you certainly have, and if I may, I'll interject one more that has come in from the group. What about a separation property that says that money, in addition to being a means of transferring value, can also be a store of value, and one can make choices how and when to achieve stuff from one's money without being shackled to consuming it when it was produced, when the cash flow was realized.
Yeah, actually, I think that's a good point. That's a good difference between money and electricity, because our ability to store electricity is very limited to batteries and capacitors and things like that, which really can't store very much on a mega scale. So whoever made that point, yeah, I got to concede that's a very good point, is that having a big stockpile of money, in a sense, does give you the freedom to wait and see what you want to do. So in that sense, yeah, that's a good point. Okay, should I continue? Or do you
Fair enough. There are other questions, but let's go ahead with the flow, and we'll see how some of these play in as we go along.
Okay, good enough. Okay, so to try to further bolster my points here, according to the National Academy of Engineering, what was the greatest engineering achievement of the 20th century in the United States? And since we don't have the little poll buttons up anymore, I'll just tell you it was universal electrification. This was, according to the National Academy of Engineering, putting electricity, and the key word being universal here, putting electricity throughout the entire country, even in rural areas, even in small towns, did more to improve the quality of life and keep the economy going and everything than any other single engineering feat in the 20th century. Would that initiative have ever passed a modern cost-benefit analysis? Would the free market have ever decided to put power into some of these rural areas and some of these small towns? I would suggest not. And in fact, what basically overriding the free market and going in and doing this did was it solved the chicken and egg problem of here's a small town, it would be a great place to put a building if only they had power, and here's a small town, it's not worth putting power in there unless they have some business or some buildings that will use the power. In the long run, this paid off in spades. But I would suggest that even with a relatively mild discount rate, this would have looked pretty bad on an NPV analysis or a cost-benefit analysis. In fact, one of my favorite lines on cost-benefit analyses comes from this book, Earth, which was written by the writers of The Daily Show. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the book, and you probably can't read the subtitle, it's called A Visitor's Guide to the Human Race. The book is written as a guidebook for aliens who find the Earth after humans have destroyed ourselves and quite a bit of the other life on it. And at the end of every chapter, they have a section called Alien Frequently Asked Questions. And so one of the alien FAQs was, if you knew some of your technological advances were coming at the expense of your environment, why did you implement them? And the answer comes back, it was a simple cost-benefit analysis. We enjoyed drinking hot coffee in a cold room in the middle of summer more than we enjoyed other animals being alive. Again, obviously somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but I would suggest that that's a rather short-sighted view of things. One other thing which I think sort of pushes the notion that we are not long-term enough in our point of view. What psychological test correlates most strongly with success in life? There is a test that you can give small children which does a better job of predicting their success later in life than any other test you can give them, including an IQ test. And it's variously called the brownie test, the marshmallow test, or the Oreo test, the cookie test, something like that. But basically the test goes like this. You give the child a brownie, and you say, that's your brownie. You may eat that brownie anytime you want to. But I'm going to go away for a little while. When I come back, if you have not eaten your brownie, I will give you a second brownie. If you have eaten your brownie, that's the only brownie you get. The number one predictor of success is the ability to defer gratification. And yet, every single one of our financial metrics, and for that matter, our policies these days, punish deferral of gratification. We just don't seem to have the notion of sacrificing today so that our children and grandchildren can live better lives tomorrow. There seems to be kind of a blind faith that technology will always improve their lives, and I'm hoping to call that into question. But Adam Smith said I could be as greedy as I want and everything would be just fine. Well, no, Adam Smith didn't really say that. He gets taken out of context a lot. Plus, I would again point out Adam Smith lived in a world where there were entire continents waiting to be exploited. We don't live in that world anymore. While I'm not willing to say we're on the lifeboat yet, I really don't think we're on the cruise ship anymore. And we need to be thinking longer term. We need to come up with metrics that reward long-term thinking. And we don't right now. And it's kind of hard. I mean, especially the notion of exponential growth, economic growth is unsustainable in the long term. Well, then what's the alternative? I've heard some people talk about steady state economies, but that's kind of hard to get all rallied behind. You know, hey, let's do as well as we did last year. That's not exactly a rallying cry, you know. So, but I still take the point that we need to be thinking longer term. At least that's my point that I'm trying to make here. So, conclusion. Increasing interconnectedness of the world, I think, is actually decreasing economic efficiency, because things like the wisdom of crowds requires that everybody make their own decision and that everybody use their own judgment. That's not what happens these days. As soon as you throw a question out, everybody Googles it, gets the same answer. And so you get the herd mentality rather than the wisdom of crowds. Exponential economic growth is unsustainable. Exponential anything is unsustainable in the long run. For example, resource consumption, or exponential growth of anything. And discounting cash flow really diminishes, or it discourages, would be a better word, serious investment in the future. It encourages people to take as much as possible today and avoid paying for it as long as possible. And if someone else pays for it, well, so much the better. I don't think that's the way we really feel, and yet a lot of what's happening these days would tend to follow this mantra. So our measures of success and progress are obsolete. That's my point. Or everything we know is wrong. What has worked for the past 200 years, if we just blindly continue to do it, we're basically going to follow the same path that past societies have done when they have blindly continued to follow what has worked for them in the past, even after circumstances changed. So that's the end of the talk.
Thank you, Pat. I think it's clearly a provocative topic, and we've got quite a queue of questions coming in from the group. So let me pose some of them for you. And I think a lot of them are perceiving a line of thought that says we are overstepping the efficient zone. We need government controls to reduce our freedoms and drag us back into it. We are unwilling to make long-term investments. We need government to come in and make long-term investments like the electrification. And so I think a lot of the questions are seeing an aggregate thrust of a policy implications, and I think that would be one of the places that you may want this to go. Perhaps not the entire place, but let me pose one of the questions that takes a look at it from that angle. It asks, you said that nobody would ever invest in large-scale projects like the electrification, but there have been big energy extraction ventures. There are new power plants that have a very long payoff time period that investors have invested in. Are you so I think pushing back on the suggestion that the things wouldn't happen without a government intervention. Your thoughts?
Yeah, you can find certainly examples of where people have made large investments, long-term investments. Generally, though, those investments are made in places where, even if it is a long time horizon, a 40-year, 50-year time horizon, the payout is visible. You don't generally see people building nuclear power plants in, say, Wyoming or something to power Wyoming. Usually, they're built logically enough near places where there's a clear line of sight to potential demand for the product. And again, you can find some exceptions, but by and large, any reasonably intelligent investor would want to see that, would want to see a way to do that. The reason I use the universal electrification, and again, my key word there is universal. They didn't say, well, let's build electric plants wherever we can justify them economically. They said, we're going to electrify the country, pretty much. There was, beyond, I suppose they could have made up some sort of hypothetical pro forma cash flows that justified it all, but they would have been waving their hands in the air, and everybody knows they would have been waving their hands in the air. What it comes down to is they just believed that was a long-term good thing to do for the country, and so it was done. It doesn't always have to be government. I'm not a big fan of government wading into areas where government doesn't belong, and certainly many types of problems, most of the types of problems that we deal with day to day are best dealt with by individuals in free markets. But my point, I think, is some of the bigger problems we're dealing with, or we're having to deal with these days, around the issue of sustainability especially, tend to fall into the tragedy of the commons types of buckets. And the free market by itself rarely can work out a good solution in a tragedy of the commons type situation. You need somebody to step in. Now, sometimes you can get a group of people who simply get together and realize that they're all in trouble if they don't do something, and they put in place rules themselves. Stuff like that is great. There are some examples of
well, I mean,
around the world that have done that.
The standard answer to tragedy of commons is to privatize the commons. I mean, is that consistent or not consistent with your point of view?
When you have a commons that is privatizable, then I think it's a terrific solution. And again, the fisheries, what's going on with a number of fisheries around the world is a great example of that, where they basically give each fisherman right to certain percentages of the catch and all that stuff in perpetuity, and they can sell it and they can pass it on to their kids and all that stuff. It's a brilliant solution. When you're talking about I think some of the other issues, like especially issues surrounding waste, surrounding pollution, the pollution side of things, or releasing greenhouse gases and things of that sort, it becomes a little more difficult to privatize the atmosphere, or say public, oceans and streams and things of that sort. If you can come up with a way to do it, then I agree that it's it's an effective solution in many cases. But sometimes you still need to have somebody kind of step in and set some rules. And the main thing you want is you want that somebody to be accountable to the people who have to live with the rules. Does that help?
Fair point. I think it does. Maybe from a different angle, let me offer a question from a different angle. The question says, sure, we can't grow at 1 or 2% a year forever, but can we do it for a long time? Or how should we view ourselves now? I mean, are we discounting entirely? Are we going to continue using the notion for a while, or how would you cue that up?
Well, the notion isn't going to go away for a very long time, if ever, I don't think, and nor should it. I mean, it's an appropriate way to think about some situations and some investments. My concern is we think about all investments, it seems like, that way. It's a tool. It's a mathematical construct and nothing more, really. It's a useful one, but we shouldn't be completely deferential to it. We shouldn't, one of the things we try to say a lot of times to clients is you can't calculate a strategy. And a lot of times I think this notion of, well, we'll come up with, we'll just build value. Well, what's value? Value is net present value. It's NPV. It's even got it in the title there, It seems to be sometimes a substitute for really thinking about the final results of the options that we have. And again, to fall back on Tima Bonsal's point, ideally we want to be comparing the long-term picture, the long-term view associated with the different options we're looking at. Collapsing all that to a single number for lack of a better word, it's just lazy.
Well, it's not merely lazy if one wants to identify what's best, and if one's buying into the DA axioms, it ultimately gets collapsed into a utility function or a preference probability or something, some measure that one can optimize. And so as decision analysts, I think fundamentally we're bought into the notion of collapsing things to a single dimension. And I think what you're raising here, and what I have a question here that's probing, is what are the bounds of utility, what are the bounds of usefulness of the NPV construct in finding our way to a way of assessing utility of outcomes? I mean, would you use it as a cornerstone construct, or would you use some other way of thinking about the utility, in a utility function way?
Well, I guess the way I think of it is, at the very least, I mean, if you make if you talk about optimizing things, right? Even if you run with NPV, usually there are other objectives, and in order to optimize NPV, you have to set boundaries on these other objectives. You can't optimize on more than one thing at a time, and so at the very least, when you're faced with a situation like that, you want to build an efficient frontier so that you can see, how much am I giving up on these other objectives by accepting or by shooting for a slightly higher NPV, and so you can actually get at least a little better feel for what the trade-offs are. And I guess the thing that hits me is that by collapsing everything to a single point in the first place, you're putting an awful lot of faith in whatever assumptions you made or whatever weightings you made on your, as you create, if you want to compare it to a utility function, on the weightings that you put in. And so at the very least, we ought to be in there sensitizing on these things, which I think, in fairness, we do a fair amount of the time. Good practitioners do that type of stuff. I don't have, off the top of my head, a replacement for NPV. I'm not sure that we need to replace it. I'm just pushing to perhaps look beyond it, and I guess I'm joining Jim Rogers in his push for longer-term thinking. And NPV typically doesn't reward long-term thinking.
So what I'm hearing from you is an exhortation to long-term thinking with or without a focus on the government doing it. One of the comments that has come in, I think, may be an example of other people that are employing some cathedral thought. The comment says, let's take a look at exploration of space. Up to this point, the government has done it. The comment suggests that the investment waxes and wanes according to political expediency, whereas there's now beginning to be some privatization of space, some private investment. SpaceX is making a large private investment, and that's potentially something that could have a long-term payoff, and we're seeing people buying into it.
Yeah, was there a question in there, or was that just
no?
Pointing that out?
That's the comment, but
yeah, I think that's perhaps another really good example of it doesn't have to be government. I'm not a big fan of government telling me how to run my life, but I'm also not a big fan of sort of blindly. Well, that's a harsh word to use. I'm also not a fan of people doing things for their own short-term gain that perhaps cause long-term problems. Somehow, the cost of those long-term problems need to be borne by the people who are causing them for their short-term gains, so that they can then turn around and make a better decision, or make a decision that truly accounts for all of the costs associated with what they're doing. And a fair amount of what we do right now tends to shoot for short-term gain, and if the costs are far enough out in the future, we tend to go, well, we don't really have to worry about those. Technology will save us, or you know, by the time you get through discounting them back to today, there's next to nothing there. I do wonder. I mean, another line that Jim Rogers used in his talk was somebody asked him something about, you know, how the decisions that he makes as CEO of the company, of Duke Energy, and he said, I want my grandchildren to look back on what I did at Duke Energy and feel like I made decisions that were in their best interest. And I'm not sure we always do that. And you can get into arguments as to, you know, what really does benefit future generations the most, and those are great discussions to have. Those are good discussions to have. But a lot of times we don't even seem to have those discussions. It's all about what maximizes NPV.
Well, fair point. And I'd like to take you back to the first segment of your talk, where you had the matrix of 1 and 0 agents, and you transitioned from a characterization of what's predictability and interconnectedness on the micro scale to what they are at the macro scale, and you pointed out that at a macro scale, there's this ridge of high efficiency down the middle, and let's pose a question which I know is not easy to answer, but is there any you know, how it was that efficiency measured in the Kaufman, and can we draw any other insights about how to measure that efficiency from the simple example, and does that shed any light on what else besides NPV we might ought to be using as a figure of merit?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one that I don't have a really good answer to, honestly. Again, I'm borrowing from Kaufman, and as I said at DAG, when it comes to things like complex nonlinear systems and agent-based modeling, I know just enough to be dangerous. So if anybody out there has comments on things or can give some input that's better grounded in experience than mine, great. Kaufman is talking primarily about biological and ecological systems. He's a molecular biologist, not an economist. He touches on an example, though, in the economics, in the sense that he was the one that said, you know, state-run economies tend to be in the stagnant zone. Free market economies tend to be at or near this efficient boundary. And I think he's right. I think that's absolutely the case. I'm just looking at some of the trends that have been going on in recent years and wondering, are there any self-correcting factors in something as humongous and complex as the global economy that might perhaps keep us from going too far into the chaotic zone? And you know, there are very often kind of self-correcting mechanisms, especially in a free market economy. You know, there's an old saying that the best cure for high prices is high prices, because they tend to kind of self-correct. If prices are too high, people stop buying it, and the price comes down. And conversely, the best cure for low prices is low prices. So it may be that there will be some sort of self-correcting mechanism that kicks in, but I don't know that. And I'm sort of throwing it out there for consideration that off the top of my head, I mean, if you buy into sort of Kaufman's 2x2 matrix there, and certainly when models are built, they do tend to follow those behaviors. I have a hard time seeing any sort of self-correcting mechanism that, for instance, reverses the trend towards ever-increasing interconnectedness. The predictability scale is, first of all, a tougher one to pin down, because it isn't literally freedom, it isn't literally regulation, it's something, it's got flavors of that in it. The predictability scale seems to be something that we can dial a bit, but I don't see anything to stop us from continuing to move upward on that matrix. and maybe I'm just missing something. And so to my mind, that goes, well, I sit and I think, well, okay, then does that mean that we are heading towards ever-increasing, volatility and chaos in the global market? And I'm throwing it, I don't know, okay? I'm throwing it out there for consideration, but I could be, as I say, I honestly don't know.
Well, I appreciate those comments. In the interest of time, let me give you one more question, which is, I guess, more in the form of a challenge. So it says that the claim that NPV does not reward long-term thinking, they don't agree with that point. And I think the idea that's being expressed here is that if the NPV reflects the productivity of the resources that are being invested, saving those resources would then allow them to be used for some other productive enterprise, and therefore choosing according to NPV would be exactly what the great-grandchildren would want. Do you follow the line of thought, and if so, do you agree with it?
I think I'm following the line of thought. I could be misinterpreting.
The point is that the choice of, if one chooses a discount rate that reflects the productivity of capital, whatever capital means, then making decisions today based on NPV using that discount rate is exactly the right thing to do to optimize for as many generations into the future as you care to look.
I'm not sure I do agree with that. I think there's, again, I may be misinterpreting the statement. But
I mean, just looking at it from your point of view, let me hypothesize that using discount rates like 8 or 9% aren't going to be sustainable umpteen generations into the future. But and even 1%, I suppose, isn't sustainable from ancient Egypt. Sorry, I interrupted.
Right. No, it's just, I guess what I'm throwing out there for consideration. A colleague of mine once pointed out, I've had several people point out to me that, for instance, you should never take a rate of return calculation, an IRR calculation, literally, because they said there's an underlying assumption there, which is that if you can get your money back quickly enough that you can then turn around and get, that there are investments you can make that will continue to give you that kind of return. That there's an underlying, or something like that, I may be misquoting them, but there is an underlying assumption there which you need to be careful with. I'm suggesting that there's a similar underlying assumption in NPV, which is you can always, if you get your money today, you can always then turn around and do productive things with it tomorrow. But what we consider to be productive things typically involve using up resources and generating waste. And as economies continue to grow exponentially, that may or may not be something that we can continue to do indefinitely. And so I guess that's sort of the angle that I take on it, is that we can calculate NPV, but we need to be aware of what it is we're assuming when we do that. And I guess the other thing that sticks in the back of my mind is the quote and the statements from Jared Diamond, who has, a lot of people, especially in the West, seem to think that history started a few hundred years ago. Diamond looks at civilizations throughout time and finds example after example of civilizations which did spectacularly well for hundreds of years. And then basically they started to exceed the capacity of their environment to support their lifestyle, and or other things changed, very often climatic changes, and they either failed to recognize the problem, or they simply refused to change their behavior. And Diamond even has a statement, which I threw up in my talk last year, about how when people are presented with challenges, they tend to cling ever more tightly to what has worked in the past. And my concern is that that's the situation that we find ourselves in, that we are starting to work our way into a resource-constrained environment here. Things are changing, and we're not changing our behaviors. We're clinging. I mean, everything that I've talked about here, everything I've criticized here, so to speak, or thrown out there for question, has worked spectacularly well for hundreds of years, generations, right? And yet, at least if you believe Diamond, and I see no reason not to believe him, that's not necessarily a reason to be complacent. So that's all I'm pushing for, is to basically get people to step back and go, yeah, yes, this has worked for generations. It's worked for hundreds of years. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to continue to work.
Well, and thank you. I think that you've ended on a thought-provoking line here. I think that you've created a lot of energy, and it's been a delight to be your discussant on here. I think we probably should wrap and turn it back to Hilda.
Okay, I do want to throw out one other comment just because of the nature of the talk. Anyone who knows me, I'm basically an optimist, okay? I mean, the talk may not reflect that. I don't think there's anything here that is beyond our capability of dealing with it. And in fact, I get kind of pumped up at the notion of figuring out how best to deal with it. I think we can definitely move forward. We can leave things in far better shape for our grandchildren than they have been for us. I just would encourage people to take a step back from what's worked in the past and perhaps think about what else what might we need to do differently. So that's basically it.
Very good. Thanks, Pat.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes today's Learning Exchange. I'd like to thank our presenters for their time and contributions to today's event. I want to remind you that you can download a copy of today's presentation by clicking on the handout icon in the upper right of the menu bar, selecting the file, and clicking Download. Alternatively, you may select from the bottom right menu, Print to PDF. Thank you for being with us today, and you may now disconnect.